Year after year, anti-Semitic attacks and sentiments continue to rise throughout the United States and around the world. In fact, a new survey from the Anti-Defamation League shows that the number of those who believe in anti-Jewish conspiracy theories and stereotypes has doubled since 2019. As Jewish and Gentile followers of the Jewish Messiah, how are we supposed to respond to this? Our guest today is the director of Jews for Jesus in Paris, and he has been working overtime with leaders from the Jewish and Christian communities to combat the insidious forms of anti-Semitism that have been and continue to sweep through France. Messiah Podcast is brought to you by First Fruits of Zion, reconciling disciples with God's prophetic promises to Israel.
Put your hand in mine together. We will walk in harmony. Let me introduce you to my teacher, the rabbi from the Galilee.
Hello and welcome back to the Messiah Podcast, where Jesus is Jewish and that changes everything. Steph, my co-host. Well, I was going to say you've got mail, but I feel like someone probably copyrighted that. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. Like maybe I should probably, I could say, I'm required to inform you that you have received correspondence.
I don't think they're going to come after us. Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, they're doing pretty well. They don't need to come after us for that. AOL too.
Are you so? Oh yeah. So I'm glad that you knew where it originally came from.
Oh, I know, my friend. Don't you worry about that. Junior high, AOL Messenger, all the way.
Did you know before AOL Messenger there was just AOL?
I did. No, I did.
Weren't those the days? Do you remember when you had to dial a phone number to go on the internet? Anyway, did we get some email?
Yes, we do have an email from Kevin in Chicago. He says he's a longtime listener of the podcast, and he wants to tell us why Jesus being Jewish has changed everything for him. Let's see what he has to say here. He says, Hashem has been calling me since I was a kid. Now, somewhere along the line, I realized the Bible I was reading came from the Jewish people, and this Savior that I loved was Jewish. I realized I was missing the very foundation of my faith by only having one part of the story. Everything Jesus said and did came through a Jewish context. This realization has changed the entire dynamic of what I believe. My daily life now consists of studying the Torah for the clarity it brings and understanding that the base of all that is loving Hashem, and living that out by loving your neighbor. Keep up the good work. Well, I'm really glad, Jacob, that people are sending us their stories because these stories are powerful. They can really help to build the kingdom. The more we share them, the more people continue to have these experiences. And there's nothing we need more right now than the kingdom, the Malchut. We're living in very troubling times. Today, we're going to discuss anti-Semitism. And so the whole tone might be more solemn as we focus on that. But it's an important topic because anti-Semitism is on the rise in the United States and really across the whole world. I mean, I think I hear almost every other day that there's a report of another terror attack in Israel even. It just seems like there's no safe place to be Jewish anymore.
Right.
Now, I mean, I know we thought things were bad 4 years ago, pre-COVID, and they were, but the stats show that they're far worse today. In fact,
really?
Yeah, I know. There's a new survey from the Anti-Defamation League, and it shows that believers in anti-Jewish conspiracy theories and the stereotypes surrounding that has doubled since 2019.
What?
So that means, and I could just give you a few stats here from different places, 85% of Americans believe at least one anti-Semitic trope, and there were 2,255 anti-Semitic hate crimes reported in the United Kingdom in 2021. France, that's close to our topic today as we talk to someone in Paris. 82% of French citizens think that anti-Semitism is a big problem, and our guest will speak more to that today.
Wait, so hold on.
Yeah, tell me.
85% of Americans have bought into at least one anti-Semitic trope?
Yes, at least.
There's like 6 million Jews in America, so if you subtract them, that's like 87%. I mean, that's extraordinary. That's like you could say it's almost everybody. That's an overwhelming majority. That's like scary.
It is scary. Yeah, especially for those of us that live here and see it all the time. I mean, only 30-something% of people turn out to vote, but 80% of people, 85% of people are believing anti-Semitic tropes. Stereotypes.
I'm not Jewish. For our listeners who might be wondering, if I was and I heard that statistic, it would blow my mind.
No, it is. I mean, listen to some of these quotes from the ADL. This is a survey from last year in 2022. They talked to 4,000 people. More than half agree Jews in business go out of their way to hire other Jews. Jews don't share my values. Jews who have too much power in the business world. We've been hearing that. And things about money.
Yeah.
And the FBI report from 2021 shows that anti-Semitic hate crimes increased by nearly 20% just from 2020 to 2021. And now they represent the majority of religious-based hate crimes, at least from 2021.
Think about the cosmic minority of, between 350 and 400 million people in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
There's maybe 6 million Jewish people. And to have that small of a minority represent like the majority of religious hate crimes.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there's lots more Muslims than Jews in the United States, but Jews are the victims of the majority of hate crimes. That's an extraordinary statistic when you put it in perspective.
It's really extraordinary, and it doesn't actually make any sense when you really think about it.
Yeah.
Now, of course, not to diminish the fact that there are other religious hate crimes and other ethnic, racist hate crimes going on, especially in the United States. But these stats, for the purposes we're speaking of today, are really mind-blowing. So our guest today can readily speak to this issue. Josh Turnil is the director of Jews for Jesus in Paris. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He was born in New York. He has a degree in French literature. He's a really busy guy. He's participated in and produced video projects such as the life story of Ruth Gottlieb, who was a resistance fighter and a Holocaust survivor. He hosts remembrance salons, or as they say in France, salons, probably not saying that right either.
Yeah.
But these are really unique things. They're recollections about the Holocaust that take place in people's homes or at an event center, I think he might do as well. But these stories are exchanged and immortalized that way. He's also uniquely qualified to speak about this issue of anti-Semitism because he'll probably tell us his Paris office is often the target of anti-Semitic threats. And he's working actively with leaders from the Jewish community and the churches in France to combat this anti-Semitism. So I'm really glad he's joining us today. And we will hear more from Josh after the break.
If you want to know the Jewish Jesus, don't miss out on a free subscription to Messiah Magazine, where you'll discover his life and teaching, learn about the biblical festivals, and get connected with Israel. Subscribe for free at messiahmagazine.org. Messiah Magazine is a free, donation-supported quarterly publication of First Fruits of Zion.
Okay, Josh Turnil, welcome. Welcome to Messiah Podcast. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Stephanie.
We're so glad that you're here. I happen to know you, but I'd really love for our listeners to learn a little bit about you and what you do at Jews for Jesus in Paris. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, your family, your current ministry?
For sure. So I'm from a Sephardic Jewish background. I was born in New York in the United States, and I moved to France in 1999. My wife is also Jewish. She's French, from an Ashkenazi background, and we have 3 kids. And what am I doing here? Basically, we're trying to share the good news that Yeshua is the Messiah with Jewish people in France. And along the way, part of that is fighting anti-Semitism, which is kind of what brings us to this podcast. So I'm very glad to be here and talk to you about it, because we've often talked about this issue, you and I, right? But
yes, we have. Unfortunately, it keeps coming back up, doesn't it?
Unfortunately. Remember Amalek, to erase his name from the heavens, So how can we remember Amalek and erase his name at the same time, So this is kind of the anti-Semitic thing. We want to forget about it. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to have any more colloquies about it. We want it to disappear. So it's this constant tension of remembering and forgetting and trying to efface Amalek and everything that is the root of hatred.
Yeah, well said.
Remember not to forget Amalek. That's one of my favorite mitzvahs. Remember, never forget to forget Amalek. being a Gentile, I've never experienced the pointy end of anti-Semitism myself, but I'm just curious. You guys are from sort of vastly different. You live in very different places, very different lives, but you're both Jewish, and I wondered if you guys, if it's not too much to ask, if you had some. What does it look like? I mean, what does it look like to be on the receiving end of this, just for like a regular Jewish person? Like, have you been discriminated against or attacked or anything just because you're Jewish? And maybe we'll start with Josh, because I don't know what's going on in France. Like, what's it like over there? Are there some anti-Semites there? Have you had some bad experiences?
Thank you, Jacob. Unfortunately, yes. The statistics here are never a never-ending disappointment. In fact, it's interesting because racism in France is on the decline, and yet anti-Semitism is on the rise. So in general, things are going well in society, and yet for Jews, it's just getting worse and worse. You have 40 more chances to be insulted or attacked if you're Jewish than if you're Muslim.
Wow.
So it kind of leads, the racist issues is a part of it, but it's actually a different thing. I could share quite a few anecdotes about anti-Semitism, unfortunately. So, of course, I've been called dirty Jew a couple of times. Or there's issues with money. If the issues of money come up all the time. The caricature that Jews want money, Jews love money. As the director of Jews for Jesus, the work that I do in France, our office has been sort of attacked, insulted, or threatened quite a few times. And most recently, we got actually a handwritten letter from a group called the Black Hand. And they sent the same letter to 7 other Jewish organizations. And as a result, we had to put in bulletproof glass. The police came and told us that they've put us on a short list of potential terrorist attacks because we have the Jews sign and the Jesus sign. So we're kind of like a double target,
For real.
For Islamic terrorists. And so they've put barricades in front of our office, which is not really what you asked me what I'm doing in France. I'm trying to bring down barriers between the Jewish people and the gospel, and the barricades don't help that, so.
Right, exactly. Wasn't it Napoleon who recalled the Great Assembly when he became the emperor, and he asked the Jewish leaders, are you Jewish or are you French? And they said, oh, well, we're Frenchmen. So we're going to be religious at home and we're going to be Frenchmen on the street, and this is how we're going to do this. And he said, okay, you're great, you're golden. And that's when Judaism actually transferred to be more of a religion than a nationality, at least in the eyes of people who see it in Europe. But that's part of what made France such, correct me if I'm wrong. I just feel like that's part of what made Jews so loyal to France, because they had a home there. He didn't kick them out like everyone else was kicking us out throughout Europe,
Jewish people have been here since before Napoleon. In fact, there's records that show that Jewish people have been in Gaul since the time of Julius Caesar. Some historians even say that the Jewish people are credited with bringing wine to France, because wine is an ancient, sort of ancestral biblical kind of thing. And so they were the first ones to plant the vineyards in Bordeaux, the wine that's enjoyed by everyone in the world. And so, so anyway, the thing is that the point of that sort of whole anecdote is that Jewish people feel profoundly French. But the anti-Semite says, no, they're not. After, all the pretty intense attacks we had, we've had a few murders, kidnappings, attacks on Jewish schools. One of the prime minister, the last prime minister, and not this one, the one in the last former presidency, said, France is not France without its Jews.
Wow.
So that was kind of a good moment, for someone in the French government, representing the French government, to say that, In Europe, the French were the first to give citizenship to Jewish people. In Poland, the Marseillaise, the French national hymn, the national anthem, was translated into Yiddish in honor of France. And there was an expression in Yiddish that Jewish people would say and use in the shtetls. They would say when something great happened, like their child was married or there was a baby in the family, they would say the following sentence. They'd say, "I'm as happy as a Jew in France." That was like a Yiddish expression that people would do. So France has this. So during the Nazi sacking of Europe, Jews were fleeing Eastern Europe, and they said, "Where are we going to go? France. We'll always be safe in France."
Unfortunately, that is no longer the case.
3/4 of the French Jewish population were deported to the camps by the French police.
Right. It wasn't even the Nazis coming in, right?
Well, the Nazis did come in, and they set up sort of a puppet. They call it a collaborationist government, but it's clear that without the help of the French police and administration, there wouldn't have been such massive
to that level
roundups. Yeah,
we got some anecdotes from Joshua here. I wondered, your situation is totally different. Surely, in the land of the free, you would not have experienced this sort of prejudice, the sting of anti-Semitism in your life. Have you, or have you?
Oh, I definitely have, unfortunately. I mean, it's everywhere. It's all around the world. My first encounter with it, I think, with anti-Semitism, I was about 11. They tore down the sukkah at our congregation. I don't know who they were. It was a very weird situation. It actually resulted in me and my friends forming like a private detective agency of all the kids at the congregation to find out who did this thing.
Cool.
And bring them to justice.
Was this in Chicago?
But, this was in Chicago. This is outside Chicago in a suburb called Long Grove, which actually does have a fairly high Jewish population. So they tore down our sukkah not once, not twice, 3 times within that week after we kept rebuilding it. Yeah, that was really scary as a kid. As an adult, I used to work in a mall kiosk in Nashville when I was in college, and I actually worked for an Israeli kiosk. Not the Dead Sea Salts. I wasn't cool enough for that. I didn't have the charming accent, but I something with teeth whitening or something. Anyway, so these 3 boys in Nashville walk by me, and they ask, "Are you working for these Israelis, for the Jewish people?" And I said, "Yeah." They're like, "Well, are you Jewish?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." You don't know what's coming next in this sort of conversation, but I'm just, going with it. And, okay, close your eyes. We have a test for you. I'm thinking, I'm not closing my eyes. So I barely closed them. They pour a bunch of change on the floor and they say, "Quick, how much did we drop?"
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So again, this idea, Jews are obsessed with money. We love money, and we love nothing more than money. And I just sort of, smirked at them, and I said something like $2.75, get out of here.
Rain Man is in the next booth if you want.
Right. Exactly. But I mean, I can't even count actually how many. I was even at a friend's wedding in Ohio. It was outside their synagogue. This is a Messianic synagogue. Outside their Messianic synagogue on the lawn, they had their chuppah up, beautiful wedding. They're walking down the aisle, and a truck drives by, and these people start screaming "Heil Hitler," raising salutes to us out the window.
Yeah.
And what do? You just look at that and
Yikes.
Go on.
Well, and that's like the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, these little, this is just from a couple people, and there's doubtless more, and then you multiply that by millions of Jewish people. I mean, the psychological burden of having to deal with that, gosh, I can't imagine.
We've talked about anti-Semitism in Europe. I've talked a little bit about it in America. What about Israel? Do you see in the homeland that we have reclaimed for ourselves, where we're supposed to be safe, do you also see anti-Semitism rising in Israel?
Well, I guess you're going to have to ask the question, what is anti-Semitism? So
let's define it.
I mean, it all comes from a caricature, doesn't it? So, I mean, the origins of the word anti-Semitism really has nothing to do with the people group, what you might consider Semites, because we're talking about Israel. There's Arabs in Israel, there's Jews in Israel, there's even Samaritans in Israel, there's Jews from all kinds of colors and nations. But actually, anti-Semitism is a bit of an ambiguous word. It was developed, before there were major groups of refugees and immigrants in Europe, and it was mostly addressing the Semitic language, Hebrew. But in France, they've actually, the thinkers on anti-Semitism are moving completely away from the word and calling it anti-Jewishness or anti-Jew hatred, which is much more specific. So I guess you'd have to ask yourself what it is, the anti-Semitism. It's a caricature that you're making of someone else, and when you're making a caricature of someone else, you're you're diminishing God's image in them, whoever they are. And I'd say that is a source of a lot of our problems, that we're created in the image of God. We don't see it ourselves sometimes, and we especially don't see it in other people. And that's where the root of a lot of problems are.
But in Israel, would you say there's anti-Jewishness in Israel?
Yeah, so I would say that, the rhetoric or the narrative that's going on in the Middle East in general is an anti-Semitic narrative. So I have a friend who's Lebanese, and when he was a kid, his father would, when he wasn't understanding something, or his father was frustrated with him, or he was saying, "Why are you being so stupid?" he would say this: "Do you want me to speak to you in Hebrew?"
Oh.
So there's, and then he remembers the first time he actually met a Jewish person, or I think he saw Israelis on TV, and one of the soldiers had taken off his helmet, and he was surprised that there weren't horns on his head. So,
right.
And then afterwards, of course, he became a believer in Jesus, and his whole worldview was transformed on the anti-Semitism that he was nourished in. I definitely see, well, from the Muslim or terrorism side, there is definitely a confusion between Israel and Jewish people. A confusion that happens also in Europe, and that Jewish people dislike, In Israel and the Middle East, that confusion is maybe it's warranted, because Jewish people are Israelis. Not all Israelis are Jews, but there is some confusion there. What's interesting is that Ben-Gurion thought that the war between the Jews and the Arabs would cease in about 100 years, because he saw it as a student of history as something without precedent. Jews were always better off in Arab lands, in Muslim lands, than in Christian lands. And so, the golden age of Europe was during the Moorish and Islamic reign in Spain. And so that is really something that has changed. There's a very large population of Muslims here in France. There are about 6-7 million. And there's a very prestigious museum called the Museum of the Arab World. And of course, 75-80% of Jews in France are Sephardic, hailing either themselves or their parents or grandparents from Islamic countries or Arabic-speaking countries. And when the museum opened, there was absolutely no mention of Jews whatsoever. And so the whole Jewish community was upset about it, because Sephardic Jews took sort of pride of their Arab-Jewish background, of the Judeo-Arabic that they spoke, of the centuries of cohabitating peacefully. Of course, they had a second sort of standard citizenship, but there was harmonious cohabitation, and in some countries that still exists. So anyway, that has definitely changed. The rhetoric has bled over into Europe, where anything that happens in Israel is being blamed squarely on the Jewish community. There's been demonstrations against Israel where you can hear "Death to the Jews."
Yeah.
Again, that mix of, Israel's the problem, and so the Jews are the problem. Right. And that's something that Jewish people in Europe have wanted to steer clear of. But now it's becoming generalized. I don't know if you know of the singer Noah, Achinoam Nini. Do you know her?
Yeah, I've heard of her.
She's an Israeli singer. She became famous because of a version that she did of Ave Maria. That she sang in before the Pope, in front of the Pope. She had
in Hebrew. That'd be pretty cool. Oh no.
No, it was in English. But she was at some point she was quite the famous singer, Yemenite background, but born and raised in Israel, and she has been very vocal against Israeli policies and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And yet her concerts have been lately been boycotted. BDS gets on her back. It's like there's like this no tolerance for, and this is where it is anti-Semitism, because you're no longer disagreeing with ideas.
Right.
You're disagreeing with the existence of a person, and in this case, with a person who would agree politically with some views against Israel.
Yeah, precisely.
So it's no longer I'm not criticizing the people, just the policies. Well, what we're seeing is that there's a basic intolerance for the existence of Jewish people as Israelis or Israelis as Jewish people.
I recently tried a social media experiment. I made an account, an anonymous account for myself on Instagram. No one knew who I was, and I just tried to engage on different posts concerning anti-Semitism and the conflict in Israel. So first, I tried to talk to white supremacists who were denying the Holocaust. Okay, it never happens. These people are crazy. Go get the Jews. That's what these people believe. So I tried to engage and just be like, oh, share your sources. Tell me how you know this is true. Immediately blocked. The white supremacists, neo-Nazis wanted absolutely nothing to do with me or the conversation. Okay, so I moved on to people who are anti-Israel. I want to know why they feel the way they do. Tell me your story. How long have you lived in Palestine? And, have you considered yourself that? I want to understand this. And everyone, literally, and I'm talking, I talked to probably a dozen people, at least these couple days that I was able to keep it up because it was really, really rough. Over a weekend, long weekend, really. But just overall, universally, I was decried as a Jew, a pig, a Zionist, which, is inherently not a bad thing. When I tried to explain that Zionism in its most, basic definition is just the belief that Jewish people, we have a right to our own homeland. Nothing about, who gets to live there alongside us or anything about that. Just the basic belief that we have a right to live in our own natural, native homeland. And it was met with death threats, literally, just over and over again, DM or in person. I honestly couldn't believe it. And this one guy seemed like he wanted to have a constructive conversation. So I invited him to a more personal conversation on the inbox. And we talked for about half a day. He asked a lot of questions that didn't make a lot of sense, but I tried to have a constructive conversation with him. And at the end, he's like, "Are you a Zionist?" I said, "Okay, by this definition that I just gave you, I believe that we have a right to our native homeland and to live there in peace. Yes, by that definition, I am a Zionist. That doesn't mean I don't care about you and your interests, and I don't, want to understand the conflict and try to bring some resolution to it." And he said, "Let me make it very clear to you, we are not at peace. There's no peace between us." This is someone who talked very nicely to me all day. "There's no peace between us. I wish death to you. I hope you're next." All these things. So, Josh.
It's no longer an exchange of ideas, and it's...
Right. You exist, yeah.
This is where most activists, most thinkers, most sociologists or politicians, police who are trying to fight anti-Semitism come to their wits' end. Because what can you do at that point?
Right.
There's no more discourse. There's no more exchange of ideas. There's no possibility to reason or to there's no even a possibility to say, okay, I want to be convinced otherwise. Doesn't matter.
Right.
You want to convince me that let's talk about these ideas. No, the simple fact that you are born of this people makes you undesirable.
Precisely.
So that's where, the main discourse is we need education. Well, many of these people are educated.
Yes, no kidding.
And so education is, in France, 80% there was a recent survey, 80% of people of students in school have heard of the Holocaust. Which is a huge victory from a teaching point of view, it means that education's working, but it's not changing at the anti-Semitism.
Sign up to become an FFOZ friend today at ffoz.org/friends and join First Fruits of Zion to restore the authentic faith and message of the Jewish Jesus. Centuries of misunderstanding about the Torah, the Jewish people, and the Jewishness of the New Testament obscured the real good news message of the kingdom. Today, a prophetic resurgence of faith is breaking out, and FFOZ friends are at the forefront of this restoration. Become a friend today at ffoz.org/friends.
The whole reason I started the social media experiment for myself was to see if we could engage with people using something called ahavat chinam. Now, of course, you know the term sinat chinam, baseless hatred, which the idea that what contributed to our exile 2,000 years ago, as the rabbis say at least, was sinat chinam, baseless hatred against each other, and not following the Torah to not necessarily the letter of the law, but the underlying principle, the heart of the Torah, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. We didn't do that. So if sinat chinam somehow contributed to our exile, then perhaps ahavat chinam can help prepare the world for the ultimate redemption. This is something we emphasize in Torah Club is this idea of baseless love. Now, even aside from this, we know Yeshua commanded us to love our enemies. So if education isn't working, how do we love anti-Semites and still combat anti-Semitism?
So what happened to me recently is that I was contacted by someone that I won't mention, but who was probably the locus of attention for anti-Semites, for Israel hatred and Holocaust denials in France. Very, very famous comedian. And for some reason, his wife came to faith in Jesus. And she reached out to me and she said, look, my husband's asking himself questions, is open to the gospel. He'd like to meet with you.
Sure. Okay.
And so I did not want to meet with him. He seemed like a pretty bad dude. He seemed sort of beyond hope.
Yeah.
And he just, and I didn't like him. I just didn't like him. I didn't like his humor. I didn't like who he was. He just rubbed me the wrong way. He's the last person I wanted to meet, And a very dear friend of mine called François Blum called me because he knew about the situation. François' aunt died in Theresienstadt and his mom survived Auschwitz. And he's a very engaged combatant of anti-Semitism on many levels. He's an admirable guy. And he said to me, Josh, he deserves to hear the gospel.
Yeah.
And that kind of struck me. I said, he deserves to hear the gospel? Why would he deserve to hear the gospel? Does anybody deserve to hear the gospel? I said, yes, he deserves to hear the gospel, and God's calling you to share the gospel with him. And so based on his recommendations, kind of like half-hearted, I went, and I just made sure I was as clear as possible. And I shared the gospel with him. It turned out the guy was soft for the word, and we started studying the New Testament together. I lost touch with him, but very recently, he came out in French news wanting to ask publicly the Jewish community for forgiveness.
Wow.
For motivating anti-Semitic thought and hatred. He said, I made a small fortune on my career, and I'm going to give that money back to Jewish causes. I'd like to meet with the chief rabbi. I want to sort of ask forgiveness. I want to go see Auschwitz, and I want to just change, and I want to help the Jewish people.
Wow.
So a huge turnaround.
No kidding. That's more than just an apology.
Yeah. He went on national news and everything. And guess what the reaction of the Jewish community was?
Honestly, at this point,
they slammed the door.
Oh, boy.
They slammed the door in his face. They couldn't hear it,
Yeah.
He's public enemy number one. No one trusted him. They said, well, this is just another ruse. He's trying to make more money. It's not sincere, this and the other. So this is where the gospel comes in, where we are called by Jesus to love our enemies and to see that transform. And I've seen that transformation in many ways. Now, this man has not become a believer in Jesus, and I don't know if he's sincere, but I think that whether he's sincere or not, that's not the point.
No.
Jesus doesn't ask us to forgive our enemies and pray for them if they're sincere or even repentant. He says, just pray for them, bless them, because that way you can be the image of God, God your Father. Not just loving people who love you back,
right?
Or loving people that deserve it. And so, I've had the privilege of meeting lots of people who had negative attitude towards Jews. I met a young woman called Aurore, and she's French, and she was a full-fledged member of the Nazi Party.
Yikes.
And she got radically saved.
Wow, that's beautiful.
And all of a sudden, she just loved the Jewish people. And now she speaks fluent Hebrew. She speaks better Hebrew than I do. She volunteered at the at Jerusalem municipality as an architect, because she's a very highly educated engineer and architect. And she worked there for free for 2 years. She loves the Jewish people. The Israelis didn't want to let her go. She was so good at her job, and she had the best reputation. I met another guy. His name's Kamal Mokhani, and Kamal grew up in Algeria, speaks fluent Arabic, grew up with all the anti-Semitic tropes and caricatures that you could think of, and he got radically saved, and today he just loves Jews. He's like keeping the feasts. And so I remember I went to speak once, and it was like a group of former Muslims that asked me to come and speak. And when we were leaving, like spiritual retreat center, they all came out and surrounded the car. And then all of a sudden, they all pulled out Israeli flags.
Oh my goodness.
And they started singing Havenu Shalom Aleichem. And they were dancing around the car as I left the compound. They, it's like over, I don't know, maybe about 500 feet down the road to the front door. And they stayed at the door, were waving and singing and, doing sort of the Muslim little this thing. And it was amazing. And so I was in a meeting with the ambassador, because we were talking about anti-Semitism and trying to do something together to fight anti-Semitism in France with the embassy and with the local evangelical community. I can talk about that as well if you want, the colloquy that we did. And I told this story to the Israeli ambassador. And she said, "Josh, I have goosebumps.
Yeah.
I've never heard of such a thing.
Same
I've never heard
here.
of such a thing."
Yeah, me
so
too.
So it's the power of the gospel to transform lives for forgiveness and to remember that to bring us back to that idea that we're all created in the image of God.
This reminds me of that story in Barchot, in the Talmud, where Rabbi Meir, there were some robbers in Rabbi Meir's neighborhood, and he prayed that they would die. And his wife says, his wife was like, "What? No, it doesn't say may sinners disappear. It says may sins disappear." Right. So she prayed, she said you should pray that they would repent. And so he prayed that they would repent, and they repented. That's how I have to keep thinking about. I think about that like twice a week when I hear about, these, because, I live in Lower Michigan, sometimes driving around, once in a while, if I get close enough to Detroit, I'll see some swastikas or something. And I just think, gosh, I hate these Nazis. And I have to remember to be like, well, don't pray that they die. Like, pray that they repent. Like, that's just so much more powerful when someone turns it around. Rather than just like absolute hatred. I got to check myself sometimes, but
thank you, Jacob.
I guess
I think we're all sort of imbibed with this culture, and there's a lot of hate rhetoric going on. There's divides all over, from the wokeism, cancel culture, Black Lives Matter. It's like you have to choose your side. You have to choose who you're gonna stand with and fight. And it's not. So you're absolutely right to bring that up.
No, so obviously Nazis should repent, and Jewish, and you're saying, that Jewish people as much as possible should strive for this ahavas chinam. But see, I'm not in the pool, right? I get splashed once in a while. I've had people get mad at me for being Jewish, even though I'm not, which I think is more just like a little bit of ignorance rather than anti-Semitism. Right. So, my feet get wet once in a while, and I think a lot of people listening to the podcast, they're not Jewish, and they're certainly not anti-Semitic, and they're probably wondering, well, okay, is there anything I can do? I'm not on the front lines of this in any respect. So what role do I play, if any, in combating anti-Semitism?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Thank you, Jacob. And I'm just very proud of the evangelical movement in France, because they've really stepped out in courageous faith and stood alongside the Jewish people. And they're the only non-Jewish group in France to have done that. And that has caused more than a few heads to turn in the Jewish community. Indeed. And one of the actual president of the National Convention of Evangelicals started the conference saying that of the pastors who were evangelical in France during World War II, most of them were in support of the Nazi puppet government. Mm-hmm. So he confessed, as the president, sort of there's a symbolic thing where he confessed that there was issues to be dealt with within the household of faith, so to speak. He wasn't speaking in terms of traditional Protestant or Catholic Christianity. He was speaking, this has happened here in our own sheepfold, And he quoted this from a pastor in Germany, a very famous pastor, Martin Niemöller, who said, "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." So there's that part. But I'd say beyond just the justice issue, which this quote says, I think that to really understand that to hate Jewish people is really to hate the source of salvation for the world. Jesus said to the Samaritan woman, a non-Jewish person, he said to her, salvation comes from the Jews.
That's right.
So if you know someone's going to invent the cure for cancer, and then you kill that person, what are you guilty of? You're guilty of more than just murder. You're guilty of something much more serious, And so I think that what can practically be done, I think recognize anti-Semitic attitudes in your own heart and mind. How do you see Jews? Do you really see them as they are? With faults, there's another character of Jews that makes them sort of saints and godly and super spiritual and that don't need Jesus, That's also a caricature. Do you really love them for who they are? Do you get to know them? So one is sort of identify in your own heart attitudes of anti-Semitism. Number two is extend a hand of fellowship to Jewish believers in Jesus. Invite them to your churches. Ask your pastor to speak on the Jewish roots of the Christian faith. Support missions to the Jews. Support work, humanitarian aid in Israel. The third thing I'd say is recognize that you can speak out. You can do something against anti-Semitism. We were just talking about the social network. What happened to you, Stephanie? It's unfortunately not unique at all. It's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
It's happening everywhere. And I would like to ask our Gentile friends who love Jesus is to just open your eyes. Because if you decide to look for it, you'll find it right away.
Right.
After this podcast, you look for it, you'll find it right away. And do something about it. Speak out against it.
Yes.
So I'd say those are the kind of things I'd suggest.
Yeah, excellent. Really, truly excellent. What about prayer, though? How can we be praying? How can our listeners be praying?
Well, it is a spiritual issue. There is a promise in God's word that Jeremiah chapter 31, God will maintain his promises to Israel as a Jewish nation, as a people. And Satan doesn't want that. And we live in a spiritual world, cosmic battle for the destiny of mankind. And Satan wants to make God into a liar, and so he wants to cancel his word. And so it's Satan who wants to destroy the Jewish people. And so there's a diabolical nature, a spiritual nature of anti-Semitism that most people who study anti-Semitism for years and years and years don't get, because they're trying to figure out the mathematical problem of anti-Semitism. We could just find the solution, then we could make it go away. But the solution, like you say, is a spiritual one that needs to be prayed against. And that's why I'm so proud of the evangelical church in France, because they said, okay, this is a problem the church can handle.
Right.
There's a problem, we can do something about it. Because our weapons are not physical, but they're mighty and spiritual for this battle. So we need to pray against anti-Semitism. Pray for the salvation of the Jewish people. Write a letter to a rabbi and say, look, we support you. Please tell us how we can pray for you. We love you. Don't think that, you're not alone. Send messages on social media to Jewish groups in support of them. Prayer is a very, very important factor in that. Ask God to help you find ways to minister to Jewish people, And when I mean minister, it doesn't mean just witness to them. It means actually where can you actually help them? Where can you actually be Jesus's hands and feet to them? Where can you be sort of a pastor or a minister to them?
Right, like James saying, you can tell someone what they need, but if you're not actually doing anything about it, not meeting the physical needs of people, the emotional needs of people, you might as well not say anything at all. So yeah, I agree. Oh, these are really excellent suggestions. Thank you so much for being here, Josh. And
thank you, Steph.
Bring a little light to this.
Hey, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Jacob. Great to be with you guys.
For his love
Well, we're grateful to have heard from Josh Turnil in Paris about anti-Semitism there, in Israel, and abroad. It's a very real and growing threat, and I hope all believers everywhere will join us in praying for the peace, not just of Jerusalem, but of Jewish people around the world. May our Messiah return soon in our days and establish his kingdom and restore the people of Israel.
Amen, amen. I couldn't agree more. Friends, thank you for joining us today. Remember, email us at podcast@ffoz.org and tell us how Jesus being Jewish has changed everything for you. Also, we'd love to know, what are some of your concerns about anti-Semitism? How do you think we can best go about combating this evil in the world? So we look forward to hearing from you. Until next time, I'm Stephanie Hammond.
And I'm Jacob Franzak.
And this has been Messiah Podcast. Shalom.
Shalom.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Messiah Podcast, where Jesus is Jewish and that changes everything. This podcast is brought to you by First Fruits of Zion and is an extension of Messiah Magazine. Subscribe for free at messiahmagazine.org. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a review along with a 5-star rating wherever you're listening now. Today's podcast was produced by myself, Stephanie Hammond, and co-hosted with Jacob Franzak. Our executive producer is Boaz Michael, and the editor-in-chief is Daniel Lancaster. This episode was directed and edited by Jeremy Schoenwald. Original music was written and performed by Joshua Aaron. The show notes for Messiah Podcast were edited by Candy Bishop and are available at messiahpodcast.org. If you're interested in learning more about the Bible from a Messianic Jewish perspective, check out Torah Club, which is an international network of small study groups who meet weekly to discuss the Bible together from a Messianic Jewish perspective. To start a club or join a club, go to torahclub.org. Until next time, shalom.
Let his word cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea. Let his love cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea.